710 KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of our microphone, 1-800-580-8255, 1-800-580-TALK, streaming live on KURV.com. Here you will hear things no one else says. They don't bother to learn. They just knee-jerk reactions to situations. And as Rush Limbaugh says, he's nothing but an entertainer, and that's about it for him. Here we try to educate, get to the reasons behind things happen. We look at history as an education tool, not as something to be used just to memorize dates, names, places, events. The important thing about them is the reasons why, and to take what we have learned and try to create an environment which will avoid the mistakes of the past in order to have a better future. But being man, we tend to repeat the mistakes of the past because though names and places and dates change, human psychology does not. And the human failings of narcissism and wrath and avarice and lust and sloth and gluttony and all the rest do not change. And those are the 7 deadly sins that man has manifested since recorded time. And so, since man cannot change, man's behavior cannot change either. And so we continuously repeat the same mistakes over and over again. And I find it a very interesting psychology as the way people are. Today we're going to talk just a little bit about my views on Napoleon Bonaparte, and then we're going to discuss the hoax of global warming with for those who wish to listen, an understanding of why it is a hoax and why man-made global warming is essentially impossible. Now, the French Revolution of 1789 overthrew an aristocratic class that had existed in that nation for, 1,000 years, 1,200 years, longer, in which a line of individuals perpetuated through birth and through birthright maintained this rule of an aristocratic class for no other reason than habit, I suppose, and indoctrination of the population to make them believe that those ruling were born to rule by divine right, and that those who were to serve were born to serve also by divine right. Just, unfortunate lottery system. I think in general, when the name Napoleon Bonaparte is raised in your social circles, it tends to receive a negative response, that he was a tyrant and that tried to conquer the world. And they often draw parallels between Napoleon and Hitler, Adolf Hitler, especially when it comes to the superficial actions that they did, the most famous of which was the invasion of Russia, which resulted in the ultimate overthrow of both Napoleon and Hitler because of their failures in attacking Russia. Interestingly enough, that in both instances, Russia was a far worse evil than either Hitler or Napoleon. But because those who write history are those that win the wars, then, of course, you have the particular viewpoint of the victors. Now, Napoleon took over reins of the government at the time of great national crisis. The monarchy had fallen, and the king and his wife were executed. Many of the aristocrats have been executed, and The response of much of the rest of the world was antagonism, because all of Europe and much of the rest of the world was, the countries were run by hereditary right of kings and aristocrats. They saw the egalitarian movement espoused by the French Revolution, and especially the regicide of King Louis and his wife. They saw that as a direct threat to their own ongoing control over their respective nations. And despite what you may be led to believe, most of the wars fought by Napoleon and the French were wars of defense, in which they were attacked by various coalitions of European countries. In fact, they were official coalitions. I don't know how many there were, 4 or 5 of them, in which they tried to destroy the ideal of freedom and independence and liberty of the people. The idea of the divine right of kings, under which most nations ran at that time, and which most nations function under today, even though the titles have changed from king and aristocracy to presidents and parliament or Congress, that essentially the mindset has not changed of those born to rule and those born to serve. This was the ideal. This was the idea that Napoleon and the French tried to destroy, and it was the reason that they were assaulted on all sides by those who wished to re-implant the idea that there is a divine right of kings, an idea that exists in most nations today. So, not really one to delve into the specifics of military campaigns or the ins and outs of political intrigue, what we can say about Napoleon and the French was that they fought to free the average citizen, and in response, the average citizen fought against those wishing to emancipate them. And this is a very important human psychological component. The indoctrination of the average person that somehow, because they happen to be born in a particular country, that they are distinct because of that from those born in another country, even if those born in other countries may be directly related by blood to them. And it's an interesting human psychology that the government promotes, and the government promotes that because it is in the interest of government to distinguish one country from another. Essentially, the only reason government exists is to protect you or the citizens from other governments. Oftentimes, the other governments are run by relatives from the same family. It's one of those really sick things that have occurred throughout the history of civilization. So, the interesting thing that I think about Napoleon is we have to understand that when you're it's easy to sit in your White Castle or your ivory tower in your academic circles and discuss events when your life is not on the line, when you are under no particular threat, and look at things in a academic manner. But if you look at Napoleon under incessant assault by various countries, and war is, of course, a game of murder, one way or another. So where do you draw the line? If you have an enemy that is trying to destroy you, where do you draw the line in defense? Where do you draw the line? When do you, if you're winning the war, where do you say, well, the war needs to end? At what point in a conflict, if you're threatened, if you are threatened and continuously threatened, do you not have the right obligation and duty to eliminate that threat, even though the threat is not immediately acted upon by the other side? In other words, if other countries are threatening to attack you and are preparing to attack you, do you have the obligation to attack them first and not allow them to gather their strength and to formalize what they're going to do. So when people look at Napoleon, you must remember that most of the wars Napoleon fought were wars of defense in one form or another against countries with the espoused purpose of eliminating the French government and Napoleon, specifically because they found Napoleon to be a threat to their continuing aristocratic reign. Now, I find it interesting that so much of what we are taught and so much of what we see on television is portraying Napoleon as an autocrat, a tyrant, even someone with psychological problems because of his height or whatever. Even to this day, we refer to the Napoleonic complex by those of shorter stature. That somehow, in order to overcompensate for their physical lack, that they try to do things through achievement, which will compensate for what they lack as far as physical stature. So it's called Napoleonic complex. I don't know what kind of complex the people who are bigger than others. I don't know if it's the giant of Jack the Beanstalk complex or whatever. And so, and we make a hero, and of course there's the famous overture, 1812 overture by Tchaikovsky, that was written, of course, long after the event, the 1812 overture, in which he commemorates the defeat of the French at the hands of the Russians. Now, I find this of particular interest because at the time of 1812 and the early part of the 19th century, the Russians, most of the country was the people were subjugated by an aristocracy that had gone on for hundreds of years, even from the time of Ivan the Terrible. So, 800, 900, 1,000 years, the Romanov dynasty. And so most of the country lived as serfs or subject to the aristocracy, so landless serfs, and then the aristocracy that did nothing other than tax and spend and live in luxury while the population suffered. So Napoleon arrives with his grand army to liberate Russia from the aristocrats, and the serfs side with the aristocrats and help ultimately defeat Napoleon. So that's very interesting human psychology. Here you are, you're subjugated by an aristocratic class that can kill with impunity, that enslaves a nation, that steals from those who produce to give to those who do not, in which the chances of advancement are essentially non-existent. And those people side with the aristocrats that have been subjugating them for 1,000 years to fight against those who have come to liberate them. Now, the question is why? Because they speak a different language, because the people have been indoctrinated to believe that it is that it is legitimate, that there are those who are born to lead and rule, and that those who are born to serve, and it is something that we need to accept in our life on earth, that we need to accept that because that is the legitimate way that things are. And that is indoctrinated into us by the state-run churches, by the government, by the media, by the system of education, that indoctrinates all into believing the class of the superior class versus the inferior class, and that goes on for perpetuity. And so how you can, the dichotomy of your life and your thoughts. In other words, here you believe in the sanctity of the czar or the king and the legitimacy of the aristocratic class, and you fight and die for them. At the same time, you're living in misery. where you work from dawn to dusk and all that you earn, except enough to live on, is taken from you, that your children die of starvation, that you have no rights whatsoever and you can be killed with impunity, that you can be incarcerated with impunity, that you have to bow down to the aristocrat, and whatever the aristocrat says, you have to accept, and you live in that environment, and so you suffer and die in misery. But at the same time, in your mind, you actually believe that this is a legitimate way of existence. When the Hebrews were freed from the tyranny of the Pharaoh and faced with some minor deprivations of hunger and thirst in the desert, they turned upon Moses and demanded to know why he had taken them out of their slavery, where they had enough food to eat and water to drink, to take them into the desert to die at the hands of the Egyptians, that it was better to live as a slave than to die free. And so nothing changes. This is a book, Exodus, of the Bible, 3,000 years old. And so human psychology doesn't change. In the Revolutionary War, after the colonists had overthrown the aristocracy of King George III, tens of thousands of colonists emigrated to Canada, where the king was still in charge. So faced with a society of free men, of being allowed to be free and independent, they preferred to live under the control of a hereditary aristocrat. We have the same thing today in the United States. We have a culture of dependency which has been created by the government with the intention of maintaining that dependency upon government. And we argue for that rather than being free. We prefer to get our sustenance from government, whether it's through the corrupt system of public education, food stamps, welfare, Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security, and don't anyone dare take away those entitlements, because we prefer to depend upon the government than to be free. And of course, the government teaches us that, doesn't it? Through the media, through the system of public education, in which we are taught that government is necessary and benevolent, that if it wasn't for government, people would starve in the streets. But what does government do that no other entity can do? Well, what government can do, which no other entity can do, is war, is concentration camps, is genocide. And so looking at what government can do that no other entity can do, one ought to be careful of government. Most of the wars that have been fought in history have been fought for no other reason than some gangster running a country decides that running one country isn't enough. He wants to run other countries. And that has been going on forever. But the amazing thing is how the people will mobilize, the subjects of a country, subject to a king, will mobilize to kill their brother in another country. And they'll do that knowing that if they win, they're just going to go back to the subjugation that they had before. And they're willing to do that. Malcolm X talked about the house slave versus the field slave, in which the house slave cared more for the master than the master cared for himself. That if the master was sick, the house slave was more concerned for the master's health than the master himself. That if the master's house caught on fire, the house slave did more to save the house than the master himself. And when the field slave that the house slave controlled said, why not be free? Why not escape? The house slave said, why should I leave when I get the leftover food from the plantation owner, and I live in the house, and I get all of that, and I wear this nice clothes? Why should I be free when I'm better off as a slave? That mentality exists today. Just because you get paid a wage doesn't mean you're not a slave. If you belong to a labor union, you're a slave. Labor unions are slavery. That's nothing else. If you don't belong to the labor union, you don't get a job. Okay? You pay your wages to the labor chiefs who live in luxury as all the aristocrats do. And so the human psychology doesn't change. So to me, and then the important about Napoleon and the great things that he did and all the bad things that supposedly he did, in my mind, were nothing more than a reaction to those who were trying to bring back the aristocracy, which, by the way, did occur. When Napoleon was finally overthrown, the aristocrats, they reinstituted, at least for a period of time, they reinstituted the aristocratic class. So Napoleon was right, essentially. The proof of it is that Napoleon was not replaced by a democratic republic or a constitutional democratic republic. He was replaced by an aristocrat. So the threats that he saw were real and are borne out by the way history unfolded. And so what we know is that the negative connotation of Napoleon is a byproduct of the revisionist history written by the aristocrats. Now let's take a look at Britain for a moment. Napoleon, though he was ultimately defeated because of his Russian campaign, the real source of the defeat of Napoleon was not Russia, but to the west, Britain. When all of Europe had fallen, the only country that remained basically opposed, that was able to maintain opposition to Napoleon, was Britain. Now, Britain has always been an anti-Semitic country. One of the first things that Napoleon did was eliminate in France and in every country that he took over all the anti-Semitic laws that were in all of these countries, which, by the way, exist in some countries even to this day, countries that the United States government under Barack Obama supports, by the way, which is a whole nother interesting thing, how the Jews of the United States support the greatest anti-Semite we've ever had in the White House. But we've discussed before. So Britain was officially, by law, at the time of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, anti-Semitic, by law. Officially, the Jews had been expelled by Edward I in the 13th century from England. Napoleon had so dominated the scene of Europe, and it so crushed the armies of Europe, that essentially the governments outside of France were without any kind of money. In fact, even Britain was essentially bankrupt. And the only way in which they were able to continue fighting Napoleon and the French was through a financier, international banker, Nathan Rothschild, who was Jewish. Without Nathan Rothschild financing the war against France, and he was essentially, hard to believe, but true, the sole source of financing for the British Army, in which he supplied almost all the financing of the British Army. So here you have Nathan Rothschild, a Jew, living in a country that is anti-Semitic, financing the war against Napoleon and the French who, among other things, were liberating Jews throughout Europe. It's very interesting. Nathan Rothschild obviously considered himself something other than a typical Jew. In fact, many of his brothers were granted titles of nobility in Austria and other places. There was a very wealthy family. And so Nathan Rothschild believed himself to be an aristocrat and lived as one, as did members of his family. And he allied himself more with the aristocracy of the anti-Semitic British government than he did with the libertarian, or egalitarian at least, French government. And if it hadn't been for Nathan Rothschild, the British could not have won the war, could not have beaten Napoleon. That's just the bottom line. Without Nathan Rothschild, the British could not have done it. They would have lost. Well, let's just see the ramifications of that effect move forward. In 1939, Britain, as anti-Semitic as Germany, passed a white paper prohibiting the emigration of European Jews into what was then a British protectorate named Palestine. In 1939, in the face of what Hitler was obviously planning to do to the Jews. Now, that was obviously an act of anti-Semitism. And during the war, when the Jews were looking for sanctuary of any source, which was denied to them essentially from all countries, including from the anti-Semitic Franklin Roosevelt and his anti-Semitic wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, two of the more scurrilous individuals of history, that the Jews were denied any sanctuary. If Palestine had been open to emigration, the Holocaust could not have occurred. The Holocaust could not have occurred without the collaboration of the British. 710 KURV, Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. Hold on your microphone back after this short break. Okay, we're back. 710 KURV, Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. Of course, we have this disgusting display of autocracy by the President of the United States, as if he has the authority to launch a war against another country. Of course, you wouldn't be the first one in the United States government to do so, but if you don't think we have a king, how is Barack Obama different in behavior than any other king? He's going to decide whether the United States is going to launch a war against Syria. Well, we must understand that Barack Obama is an Islamist, and since he's become president, he's done everything he can to bring forth a caliphate of Islam once again. Him and the grossly incompetent Hillary Clinton. If you look at what's happened in the Middle East since they came into office, you look at what's going on in Syria, in Libya, you see what's going on in Iran, in Jordan and other countries in the Middle East, a complete chaos. And in Egypt and Turkey, by the way, in which the Islamists are on the rise. And that is a direct result of what Barack Obama is doing. Whether he's doing it intentionally or subliminally, he's nothing but an Uncle Tom anyway, because his job is to keep the black man down at the behest of the aristocrats named Clinton and Pelosi and the rest of the white Anglo-Saxon northeastern elitist tyranny that has so dominated the political scene in this country for 100 years. The psychology of the serf fighting those wishing to free them is nothing new. It goes back a long, long time, and is the reason Napoleon was defeated, who tried to bring liberty to Russia, and then the serfs who were subject to the Tsar defeated Napoleon. Nathan Rothschild, living in a country with anti-Semitic laws, finances the army that is fighting against the army that wishes to liberate Jews. What a world we live in. But but it's important to understand the psychology, because human psychology crosses all borders and is not affected by language. Human psychology is what is manipulated by government in order to get people to do things which are overtly counter to their individual interests. So that is the amazing thing. Just one other thought on the disgusting situation in the United States today. The threat, if you look at most revolutions and overthrowing of government, the revolutions are not done by the peasants and the poor. They are done by the rising tide of producers in most societies. In the French Revolution, the overthrow of the government was not done by the peasants. It was done by the new class of merchants and producers that were chafing at the bit of indolent aristocracy that did nothing but waste money in order for themselves and take from the producing class. The American Revolution was the same. The American Revolution was fought by Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. These are not poor people. These were landed people. They fought against the tyranny of an aristocratic class, not because of economics primarily, but because of ideology, the ideology that chafed them, as expressly written so brilliantly by Thomas Paine, that there was no divine right of kings, that each person was born free and independent, and government existed to guarantee that freedom and independence. That government is to serve the people are not to serve the government. The recent tax law changes in the United States implemented by our feckless Congress and our tyrant of a president had nothing to do with revenues to the government. Last year, the government spent $4 trillion and more. $1.2 trillion of that expenditure was from printed money. The recent tax increases, which have affected only a very small percentage of the population, the upper 2%, as is so boldly claimed by the media and the president and the government, it's only going to affect 2%, 98% unaffected, because that's what the Constitution says. The Constitution says that you can steal as long as it's from a minority of the population, because that's what the Constitution says, right? And so, therefore, only 2% of the population can be abused, then that's perfectly acceptable, which is the same philosophy in Germany. Well, it's only the Jews. What difference does it make? They're only a small part of the population. So we can be unjust with them. We can steal from them. We can kill them because the majority doesn't care. So the top 2% of the population earners in the United States, well, we can take from them because they're only 2%. Well, the increase in taxes on that 2% is going to raise about $50 billion or so, a pittance when they've already printed up $1.2 trillion. So one might ask the question, if they're willing to print $1.2 trillion, why not print another $50 billion? 1.25. Why not do that? What's the difference? You've already printed up 1.2 trillion. Why not print up another 4%? Well, the reason is that $50 billion that they steal from the producing class has absolutely nothing to do with revenue and government monies. Its purpose is nothing other than to weaken that group of individuals that could develop political power to overthrow the existing government. That is the reason that the government does that. And how that point is missed by everyone is amazing to me. The revolutionary wars that occur are almost always done not by the poorest elements of society, not the ones who are most subject. But it's interesting because usually the ones that are most subjugated are the ones that side with the government. And is that not in our case today? Who sides with the government today? The most subjugated of all peoples, blacks, so-called Hispanics. The ones who are most subjugated are the ones who most support the big government. All right, I want to turn now to the hoax of global warming, and I'm going to illustrate the nonsense that is promoted throughout the media and the system of public education concerning the issue of global warming. Now, those of us old enough to remember or recall that the same chattering class of individuals, of pseudo-intellectuals, that were trying to convince us in the 1970s of an impending ice age are exactly the same people that are now telling us there's going to be an impending burning up of the earth. James Hansen, the guru of global warming hysteria today, was the one who created the computer models in the 1970s predicting an impending ice age. The only consistency within this group of so-called climatologists has been their method of inventing scenarios of possible cataclysmic occurrences to create a sense of panic in an effort to promote mass hysteria. Their prognostications are not tempered by the proven contradictory information. We know that Earth has gone through many cycles of warming and cooling. As recently as 14,000 years ago, most of the northern hemisphere was covered by glaciers. As the ice age drew to a close, these glaciers receded, forming the Great Lakes. That same process, which of course is long before civilization, long before man's combustion of fossil fuels. If that event was occurring today, the receding of the glaciers, which eventually formed the Great Lakes, would have been attributed to man-made activities. So we can see the nonsense of it all. But let's look at this thing a little more analytically, something that is never done in the media or the system of public education. What is the process by which we learn that the Earth is warming? Well, I had thought, and you know no one ever asked that question, do they? I mean, no one ever talks about, well, how do these guys know the Earth is warming? How do we know the temperature is getting warmer? How do we know this? I assume we all think it's due to some sophisticated technology, but the fact of the matter is when they're talking about a trend over 100 years or so, well, what kind of sophisticated technology existed 100 years ago that could determine that the entire Earth is warming? Well, the technology being used is a thermometer, which is an ancient device, 300 years old, not particularly super accurate. Then these thermometers are placed in weather stations around the world, almost all on land, naturally, though over 70% of the Earth is covered by water. No, there are no thermometers up there in the Himalayas, and there's no thermometers in many other parts of the world. In fact, the number of thermometers or weather stations from which data is drawn is only about 5,000. That equates to one thermometer or one measuring station for every 40,000 square miles of the Earth's surface. 40,000 miles is, I looked it up, because I was trying to get a good analogy here, is the size of Ohio. So imagine living in Ohio and anywhere in Ohio and then being determining the weather, the temperature where you're at because of one thermometer somewhere in the state. Imagine if that was your only source of information. But that is exactly what the climatologists and the hoaxers are doing. They're saying that by reading the temperature readings off a thermometer, one thermometer every 40,000 square miles on Earth's surface, that is accurate enough to make an assessment as to the global trend of temperature on Earth. They never tell you what altitude the thermometer is at. They never tell you what things are close to the thermometer which may be affecting it. We know that there are thermometers that are near airports. We know there are thermometers near exhaust pipes. We know there are thermometers near factories, because these thermometers were there before the airplane, before the urbanization process we had reached that level, and they're still being read. Now, what happens when you live near an urban environment? Urban environments tend to be warmer than the environment surrounding them, because the urban environment produces heat independently of climate. The heat, automobiles, people, air conditioning systems, whatever, electric generators, all of those things produce heat, which have nothing to do with the general climate on Earth, but will affect the thermometers that are located near those regions, near those artifacts. And so therefore, and they're used. So they actually use the readings off of those thermometers and they put them into the calculation. Now, these so-called climatologists and government types are not very bright. They really haven't covered all their bases, but they're assuming there's a stupidity out there, or at least an ignorance of the general population, an assumption that often proves to be correct. But the fact of the matter is that if you look at the independent measurements that are drawn outside of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, all these other government hack agencies that compile the data, if you look at each individual state's official readings as to the highest temperatures ever recorded in the state, what you'll find is something interesting. That in 33 of the 50 states, the highest recorded reading of temperature ever in those states was prior to 1950, a number of those states prior to 1900. Now, if global warming was a consequence of man's activities, one would expect a trend upwards year to year as the industrialization and combustion of fossil fuels increases. One would expect that the temperatures, if they're directly related to the combustion of fossil fuels, that the trend would be inexorably upwards, and that the highest temperatures would not be in 1950, but now. So how does one explain? Well, they don't bother to explain because they don't cover their bases. Well, let's take a look scientifically. We already have the empirical. We have the empirical evidence that global warming is not occurring, at least not occurring anything due to man. We also have the understanding that the methodology used is archaic, untrustworthy, and prone to fraud. Let's take a look at the greenhouse gas effect itself. Why is it called the greenhouse gas effect? Well, a greenhouse is an enclosure of glass where you have plants. And that exists in order to maintain an environment of greater humidity and greater temperature than the outside environment, conducive to the growth of those plants. How does that work? Why is it warmer inside a greenhouse than outside? Well, the reason is light passes through glass. That's why these greenhouses are made out of glass, because it allows the passage of light energy through the glass. Because light energy is short wavelength energy and goes through the glass without too much trouble. When energy source strikes a molecule, sun's rays are energy. They strike molecules, and those molecules increase their energy, and one of the things that they do is they increase their activity. When molecules increase their activity, it raises the temperature. What is temperature? Temperature is the measure of the average molecular movement in the region being measured. That's what temperature is. And as the average molecular movement in a region increases, the temperature goes up, because it is a direct measure of average molecular activity. The sun's rays increase the average molecular activity in the molecules within the greenhouse, and that increases their energy levels. But molecules and atoms want to be at their most stable and lowest energy level, and therefore they busily try to figure out ways to get rid of their unwanted extra energy. And they do that through the emission of energy in different form, in light and in heat, among other things. Heat is infrared. That's what heat is. So the emission from molecules, they send out a wavelength, which is we call infrared, and it is a wavelength which is longer than natural light, and therefore difficult to go back through the glass because the wavelength being longer, it has less ability to go through the obstacle of glass. And so the infrared rays stay trapped within the glass enclosed environment, thereby raising the temperature, keeping the energy inside the glass, and raising the temperature within the greenhouse. Now, what is a greenhouse gas? Well, they call it a greenhouse gas because the effect is similar. There are molecules which have the capacity to absorb infrared rays, thereby increasing their activity, increasing molecular action, and increasing temperature, which is the average, which is a measure of average molecular movement. However, whereas glass blocks the transmission of infrared rays through a physical property, molecules absorb infrared rays as a chemical property. The rays are absorbed by certain molecules, for whatever reason, they're absorbed, thereby increasing the activity of those molecules, increasing the temperature. Well, what we find in study of these atoms and molecules, that the absorption is not due to the atoms themselves, but due to the molecules. And so it is certain molecules and not the actual individual atoms that exhibit the greenhouse gas effect. And that's extremely important, as you will notice, you will find, as we will explain as we move on with this discussion. There are forces which hold atoms together, and these are called atomic bonds. Then there are forces. And that's an atom. An atom is an element. An atom is what makes up an element. That is the lowest, the simplest structure that exhibits a certain consistent chemical and physical properties. In other words, you have a hydrogen atom. It has electrons, it has neutron, it has proton. I guess it doesn't have a neutron. It has a proton. And the individual parts, the electrons, the protons, the neutrons of atoms, they have all the same properties. However, when they're configured in a certain way, certain number of neutrons, protons, and electrons in a particular, when they're in a typical atomic structure, that exhibits certain properties which are consistent for every configuration that is like that. In other words, every sodium atom behaves like every other sodium atom. And a sodium atom is distinguished from a nitrogen atom or an oxygen atom or a hydrogen atom or a helium atom based upon that structure. Whereas all protons are the same, all neutrons are the same, all electrons are the same, regardless of where they're in, what atom they're in, they're all the same. Each atom is different from every other atom based upon the numbers of neutrons, protons, and electrons within the atom. Molecules are the joining of more than one atom forming a larger structure. Molecules can be formed of the same atoms, or they can be formed of different atoms. Okay. So now, to illustrate that the greenhouse gas effect is a product of molecular structure and not of atomic structure, we have the nitrogen and oxygen atom. Good example. Nitrogen atom, which is nitrogen molecule, which is two atoms of nitrogen put together, which is found in the Earth's atmosphere in the greatest abundance. 78% of the molecules in the Earth's atmosphere are nitrogen molecules. The nitrogen molecule has no greenhouse gas effect. In other words, it has almost zero capacity to absorb infrared rays. The oxygen atom also, which is, the oxygen molecules, I'm confusing the terms, I'm sorry. The two atoms of oxygen which create the oxygen molecule So the oxygen molecule, which is the second most dominant, the second most common element in the Earth's atmosphere, also has no greenhouse gas effect. So neither the nitrogen molecule nor the oxygen molecule have any greenhouse gas effect. However, if you take two nitrogen atoms and combine them with one oxygen atom, forming the nitric oxide molecule, that does have greenhouse gas effect. So even though nitrogen in and of itself independently has no greenhouse gas effect, oxygen independently has no greenhouse gas effect, you combine the two and there's a greenhouse gas effect, which tells you what? That is the architecture of the molecule that determines greenhouse gas effect and not the individual atoms that make up the molecule. All right, let's move on. Let's take a look at the greenhouse gas effect in Earth's atmosphere, which is, so you have molecules which are greenhouse gas molecules, predominantly carbon dioxide and water vapor. These are the two dominant greenhouse gas molecules on Earth and in our planetary system. And so we can make a study of the greenhouse gas effect on other planets and on Earth based upon a study of water vapor and carbon dioxide. Now, let's look at Earth. Where do greenhouse gas molecules come from? Well, the water vapor in the atmosphere comes from the underlying liquid water, and the atmospheric concentration of water vapor is independent of any of man's activities. Now looking at carbon dioxide in the atmosphere comes from primarily the process of plants and animals' metabolic processes. And essentially coming from the breakdown of organic molecules in human beings and animals and plants by bacteria. And in that breakdown process, carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. And we'll go on with this study of the greenhouse gas effect after this short and completely superfluous station break. 7 KRV, home of the Iron Microphone, back after this short break. Second KRV, Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. We're talking about the greenhouse gas effect, well beyond the understanding of any congressman, senator, or president of these United States. Okay, so we are a carbon-based, life is carbon-based on Earth. You and I, plants and animals, all that are made of carbon, long-chain carbon molecules. The carbon that makes up each human being and each animal at one time was in the air. All the carbon in our body was once our structure of all our organs, everything we have, the carbon that makes up our body and all of our organs and all of our tissues was once carbon dioxide in the air. The carbon dioxide in the air gets taken in by plants, which have a molecule called chlorophyll, which has the intriguing capacity of converting carbon dioxide in the air with the addition of energy from the sun to create long-chain carbon molecules. Man eats the plants or eats the animals that had eaten the plants, and that is where we get the carbon that our body uses, because we cannot do photosynthesis. We don't have any chlorophyll. Okay, so human beings and animals, we depend on the plant life in order to give us a sustenance which allows us to survive. Okay, and so in the process of life, the plant dies, the animal dies, the human being dies. And the reason the world isn't littered with dead bodies of animals and plants and people is because there are bacteria which digest organic material. These bacteria digest all carbon, and in the digestive process of these bacteria, they produce carbon dioxide. The vast majority of carbon dioxide in the environment, in fact, 97% of all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, comes from natural metabolic processes. The 3% that is not produced by what we would call, or what the environmentalists call, metabolic natural processes, are really natural also, except that it doesn't fit the lives of the fanatics in the environmentalist movements. What is a fossil fuel? A fossil fuel is nothing other than carbon-based plants, animals, and human beings that somehow avoided the bacteria and from being chewed up and their carbon being thrown out into carbon dioxide being in the environment back 1,000 million years ago. Through processes, geological processes, plants, animals, human beings were underground, were not getting at by the bacteria, and over time became compressed into what we call coal and oil. Coal and oil are organic substances and are naturally formed. When they are burned, the energy in them is released through a combustion process devised by man, whether it's just igniting it somehow, and then through the combustion process, just the same as with the metabolic process of bacteria, the long carbon chains are metabolized or combusted using oxygen and a source of energy, and with that, carbon dioxide is released into the environment, releasing great amounts of energy. The carbon dioxide released through the combustion of fossil fuel and oil is exactly the same carbon dioxide released in the metabolic processes that break down plants, animals, and human beings at this very moment and every second of every day. The carbon dioxide released into the environment from the burning of coal and oil is identical in every way from the carbon dioxide being released through the breakdown of plants and animals and human beings. But we're going to differentiate that for the sake of argument from the other carbon dioxide, and that constitutes 3% of the carbon dioxide in the Earth's environment. But let's go a little further with this. There's another, as we have alluded to earlier, there's another greenhouse gas molecule in the Earth's atmosphere, and it's water vapor. And it turns out that water vapor, and not carbon dioxide, is the dominant molecule in Earth's atmosphere. In fact, water vapor makes up 95% of the greenhouse gas molecules in the Earth's atmosphere. So let's take a look at the Earth's atmosphere. For every 1 million molecules in Earth's atmosphere, there are approximately 10,000 molecules of water vapor. Earth's atmosphere, 1% of Earth's atmosphere is greenhouse gas molecules. 95% of that 1% are H2O vapor molecules. Also, there are about 400 carbon dioxide molecules for every 1 million molecules in Earth's atmosphere. And these are the predominant greenhouse gas molecules in Earth's atmosphere. Thus, of the 10,400 greenhouse gas molecules in Earth's atmosphere, only 12, or 3% of the carbon dioxide amount, 3% of 400, for those of you who went to some public education, that's 3% of 400, 0.03 times 400 is 12. That's for those of you who've gone through the system of public education. You want to grasp that number. So out of the 10,000, for every 10,400 greenhouse gas molecules in the Earth's atmosphere, 12 are produced through the combustion of fossil fuel. a relatively small amount. Now, the hysterics of global warming, what are they demanding? They're demanding a 20% reduction on the combustion of fossil fuels, which, of course, would be catastrophic to the economies of the world. But let's take a look what a 20% reduction would do. 20% reduction would reduce the number of greenhouse gas molecules by 1 for every 4,000 greenhouse gas molecules in the Earth's atmosphere. 1 for more than every 4,000. So it's like nothing. Okay, so we can see that even based on the numbers of molecules, that the elimination of 20% of the combustion of fossil fuels, of coal and oil, would have no effect whatsoever on the composition of greenhouse gas molecules in the Earth's atmosphere. But you know what? There's even more to this than that. Because there are properties, the greenhouse gas properties of water vapor and carbon dioxide are vastly different based upon physics. And to understand that, let's take a look at our solar system. Let's take a look at the moon. The Earth's moon, which orbits the Earth, occupies essentially the same region in space as the Earth, and thus receives the relative to surface area, the same amount of sun's energy. Now, the moon, unlike the Earth, does not have an atmosphere and experiences enormous daily temperature swings. In the daytime, going from 250 degrees above Fahrenheit to the evening of 250 degrees or less once the sun in the evening. So every day on the moon, you have a 500-degree temperature change on the surface of the moon. Pretty rough. Let's go take a look at Mars. Now, Mars does have an atmosphere, and therefore does exhibit a greenhouse gas effect. Evidence of Mars' greenhouse gas effect is noted by a day-to-evening temperature variance much narrower than that of the moon. Now, though Mars is farther away from the sun than the moon is, despite that, Mars' evening temperatures are much warmer than that of the moon. Remember, moon's temperatures go down below 250 degrees at night, and even though it's closer to the sun than the Mars temperatures average about 70 degrees below zero in the evening. A very significant difference. And Mars' daily variance is only about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So Mars has far less variance in daytime to nighttime temperatures than does the moon, because of the Mars atmosphere and its greenhouse gas effect. Let's take a look at another planet. Let's look at Venus. Venus is much closer to the sun than either Mars or Earth. And Mars has a daily temperature of 800 degrees Fahrenheit that does not change. Why is that? Because Venus has an atmosphere that's so thick that no heat can escape from the surface of Venus, and therefore it has a constant temperature. If we look now at Mercury, which is even closer to the sun than Venus, we find a daily temperature variance of 1,100 degrees. Because even though Mercury is much closer to the sun than is Venus, because Mercury has no atmosphere, its nighttime temperatures go below 300 degrees Fahrenheit. That's even colder than Mars, even though Mars is many, many millions of miles further away from the sun than is Mercury, evidence of the importance of the atmosphere and the greenhouse gas effect. Now, Earth, Earth's average daily temperature variance is about 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So on the Earth, the variance from daytime to nighttime temperatures averages about 30 degrees across the planet of the Earth. Now, let's take a look at a little more data. Mars' atmosphere, though it exists, is only 1/160th as dense as that of Earth's. However, the greenhouse gas concentration of Mars is actually greater than that of Earth's, because though Earth's greenhouse gas composition of its atmosphere is only 1%, 99% of the greenhouse gas molecule of the atmospheric molecules on Mars, 99% are greenhouse gas molecules, carbon dioxide. So therefore, even though Mars' density of the atmosphere is 0.02 kilograms per cubic meter compared to Earth's 1.2 kilogram per cubic meter, in other words, the Earth's mass density is 60 times greater than that of Mars. Mars has, because all of its molecules essentially are greenhouse gas molecules, therefore, the concentration, the mass concentration of greenhouse gas molecules on Mars is 20 grams per cubic meter, whereas on Earth it is only 12 grams per cubic meter. Also, since carbon dioxide's molecular mass is 2.5 times greater than water than H2O vapor, the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gas molecules on Mars is actually 4 times greater than that of Earth's. Looking at Venus, Venus has a greenhouse gas concentration 9,000 times greater than that of Earth's, and an atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration nearly 1 million times greater than Earth's. Venus has a greenhouse gas molecular mass more than 22,000 times greater than that of Earth's. When comparing greenhouse gas effect with greenhouse gas concentration, one notes an oddity. The predicted greenhouse gas effect is out of order with the greenhouse gas concentration. The order of greenhouse gas concentrations from lesser to greater is Mercury with the least, then Earth, then Mars, then Venus. But the order of greenhouse gas effect from lesser to greater is Mercury, then Mars, then Earth, then Venus. Why is Earth's greenhouse gas effect greater than that of Mars, despite Mars having a greater greenhouse gas concentration? And the answer lies in the difference in the makeup of the greenhouse gas molecules among the planets. Earth, unlike Mars or Venus, has water vapor as the dominant greenhouse gas molecule, accounting for 95% of the greenhouse gas molecules in Earth's atmosphere. Mars and Venus greenhouse gas concentration in their atmosphere is approximately 99% carbon dioxide. To understand why this is important, we need to look at other properties of matter. One is the change in temperature. The quantity of energy required to achieve temperature change is referred to as a substance's specific heat. For example, to elevate the temperature of 1 gram of liquid H2O, to elevate that temperature by 1 degree centigrade requires 1 calorie of energy. That is the specific heat of water. The other event which a substance can undergo is a phase change. The phases of a substance are solid, liquid, and gas. The energy required to change a substance from one phase to another is called its latent energy. It is referred to as latent energy because the change in phase occurs without a change in temperature. So when liquid H2O converts to vapor H2O, even though it absorbs a great deal of energy, there is no change in temperature when that change occurs. And that's very, very important to understand. Also, change in phase requires far more energy than temperature elevation. The change in phase is the separation of molecules. As the solid ice of H2O becomes liquid, and liquid becomes gas, the molecules spread apart. So that what makes liquid into vapor is the molecules spread apart enough so that the H2O molecules can go into the atmosphere because now they are so much less dense than water. That's why rainfall falls. When it's water, it falls because it's more dense than the atmosphere will can support. Now, to change H2O from its liquid phase to its gaseous or vapor phase requires 540 calories of energy. So to change 1 gram of liquid H2O to 1 gram of vapor requires 540 calories of energy. Compare that to the 1 calorie of energy required to elevate the temperature of liquid H2O 1 degree centigrade. So on Earth, if we look at different regions on Earth, And we can, the practical effect is this. Why is the desert hotter in the day and cooler at night than a humid region? And it is because of the greenhouse gas effect. The greenhouse gas molecules does more than maintain, than keep things warm. It also keeps things cool. Greenhouse gas molecules block sun's radiation coming from the sun. That is why the Earth's surface is not 250 degrees Fahrenheit, as is the moon's. And so the greenhouse gas effect is really not really only a question of warming. It is a buffering. It tends to keep things cooler and also tends to keep things warmer. It is a buffer. Okay? So when things are cool, it tends to maintain a stability and tends to counteract the cooling and the general cooling and warming processes. After the sun has, the sun's rays are blocked by the greenhouse gas molecules and keeps the Earth's surface cooler. However, once the sun has set, the energy now being dissipated from the surface is blocked to some degree by the water vapor and carbon dioxide molecules, tending to keep the Earth's surface warmer when the sun sets, which is why the Earth doesn't go 250 degrees below zero. So a far more accurate measurement. So let's go back to the desert. So the desert with less water vapor, even though the same amount of carbon dioxide, less water vapor in the atmosphere, allows more sun's rays to pass during the daytime. So the desert is hotter. But then allows more heat energy to escape at night, once again because of lack of water vapor. Therefore, the desert, with less humidity in the atmosphere, allows more energy to come in and more energy to leave, therefore a wider difference between the highs of the days and the lows at night, which is why the desert is hotter in the day and cooler at night than a more humid region. And so the water vapor in the environment demonstrates the greenhouse gas effect is to measure it properly, it is not how high the temperature is in the day, which demonstrates the greenhouse gas effect. It is the difference between the day's highs and the day's lows, which actually demonstrate the effectiveness of the greenhouse gas effect. So the narrower the day to evening temperature is, the more effective is the greenhouse gas effect. Now, the greenhouse gas effect on Earth is more effective than that on Mars, because the greenhouse gas effect on Mars is due to carbon dioxide, not water vapor. Let's take a look at how powerful the effect is of these latent heat effects that are due to phase change. Water vapor in Earth's atmosphere is 10 times the mass of carbon dioxide. So for every calorie of energy that carbon dioxide absorbs in Earth's atmosphere, because of the latent energy due to phase change. Remember, carbon dioxide exists only in one phase on Earth in natural form, and that's the gaseous phase. The only way to have dry ice, solid carbon dioxide, is by putting it under tremendous pressure and therefore forcing the carbon dioxide molecules closer together, making it into a solid. Of course, once it's exposed to the natural atmospheric pressures, it immediately reverts back to its gaseous phase. So therefore, water vapor being much more prevalent and also having the property of phase change, latent heat, every gram of water absorbs far, far greater amounts of energy than a gram of carbon dioxide. So 1 gram of water, of H2O conversion from liquid to water, absorbs 540 calories without a change in phase. Also, since there are 10 times the amount of water vapor in Earth's atmosphere compared to that of carbon dioxide, the absorptive capacity of carbon dioxide of water vapor compared to carbon dioxide is enormous. What we have then is that 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 water vapor absorbs much more heat energy than carbon dioxide. So through calculations, what we have figured out, and I guess I haven't put the calculations down, for every calorie of energy that carbon dioxide absorbs, water vapor in the atmosphere absorbs 700,000 calories. If you try to reduce the level of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere by 20%, which is what the environmentalists wish to do, that means that that you will reduce the absorption of heat energy in Earth's atmosphere by 1 calorie for every 3.5 million calories now being absorbed. Reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere by 20% will reduce the amount of heat energy absorbed in Earth's atmosphere 1 calorie for every 3.5 million calories being absorbed. Obviously of no significance. I'm trying to look at these calculations here. Okay, here they are. I wonder where they were. The specific heat of water is 1 calorie per gram, but the latent heat of vaporization of water is 540 calories per gram. 1 gram of liquid water absorbs 2,160 calories more than 1 gram of carbon dioxide. In the Earth's atmosphere, since the Earth has 10 grams of water vapor for every gram of carbon dioxide, thus for every calorie of energy absorbed by carbon dioxide, liquid water absorbs 21,600 calories. However, only 3% of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is produced by the combustion of fossil fuels. Therefore, for every calorie of energy absorbed by man-made carbon dioxide, water absorbs 700,000 calories of energy. Elimination of 100% of the combustion of fossil fuels, therefore, would eliminate 1 calorie of heat energy absorbed for every 700,000 calories absorbed in Earth's atmosphere, obviously of no significance. If you do the 20% reduction, then that takes you a saving of 1 calorie for every 3.5 million calories of total absorptive capacity in Earth's atmosphere of sun's radiant energy. Therefore, carbon dioxide is completely irrelevant in the terms of Earth's temperature. Now, despite the irrelevance of carbon dioxide in the temperature, we still have this mass hysteria being promoted by the government and the environmentalists. So why is that? Okay, I think the explanation is pretty clear that the carbon dioxide in Earth's environment has essentially no effect on the climate of Earth. That it's water vapor, which is by far the effective molecule, and that reduction of carbon dioxide, even to eliminate carbon dioxide from the Earth's atmosphere, would not affect temperature at all, clearly eliminating 100%. Another thing about climate change, I want to get into climate change, once it became evident that there's no increase in Earth's temperature, certainly no increase due to man's combustion of fossil fuel, in order for an environmentalist lobby to maintain their funding and to maintain their power, they had to alter their story. And now it is not a question of temperature, it's a question of climate change, that the alteration in the climate due to the combustion of fossil fuels is manifested in whatever is going on now that it's always gone on before. But the fact of the matter is that an increased greenhouse gas effect decreases climate change, because what does climate change essentially due to? Is due to changes in temperature. Climate change, for all practical purposes, is a byproduct of temperature change. Since the temperature change is decreased with increasing greenhouse gas effect, therefore the climate change would decrease, not increase, with increasing amounts of greenhouse gas molecules in the atmosphere. These are all physical properties, easily proved, known by everyone. Why this nonsense continues is just amazing to me. Let's take a look at the environmental hucksters in general. If you have an organization like the Sierra Club or the WWF or whatever they call themselves or whoever they call themselves, and they exist based upon donations that because of the promotion of the mass hysteria that they themselves do, if those organizations come out with the reality that nothing they do means anything and that the earth is fine without the protections of the environmentalists and their lobbyists, then, of course, they would lose all their funding, wouldn't they? And so it is essential for them to maintain the mass hysteria and to maintain their funding is to keep promoting these lies. Now, I have to go to a break, but we're going to take a look at, now, why would government get involved with these lies? Well, that's pretty simple, isn't it? Why government would want to create a system which empowers them. We'll be back after a short break. 7 KRV, Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. Okay, 7 KRV, Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, finishing up with the host of global warming. This is the global warming hysteria is a byproduct of politics more than anything else. The government, of course, promotes the hysteria because they see it as a source of funding for its own nefarious activities. And also, if the government can dictate the amount of energy that an individual or entity can utilize, then the government has control over your life. And that is all the government is interested in, is controlling your life. And of course, rewarding its friends, these solar companies, windmill companies that receive huge amounts of subsidies from the United States government are invariably individuals that have contributed money to politicians. And so one back scratches the other, one hand washes the other, or whatever it is. I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. So it's a complete corruption, typical corruption of government that creates an hysteria, justifying paying subsidies to Solera and other hucksters in return for campaign contributions, and so the cycle keeps on going. The Sierra Club and all the rest promote the hysteria of global warming in order to generate funding for themselves, which just gives them the money to pay off politicians, who then promote through their agencies the continuing canard that global warming is occurring, and then the dissemination of the propaganda goes through the media and the system of public education, and so it just goes on and on and on. And the rest of us pay for it, and pay for it more with just money, but with a decrease in a negative effect on our lifestyle. Okay, so, I mean, that's it. You're never going to hear it anywhere. No one's going to tell you that stuff because, they don't, whatever. So, I'm the only one that bothers because I think it's really quite fascinating, but it's an understanding of the way government works, politics work, people work, human psychology. It's all kind of wrapped up. And every one of these things always manifests. We can discuss agricultural policy, energy policy, foreign policy, and they all basically revolve around the same mechanisms and methodologies of actions. Government trying to maintain its authority, trying to subjugate the people, justifying its existence, and it's always the same. And then the propagandist arms of the government, which is the media and the system of public education, which disseminates this jossim and flotsam throughout our society, making people believe that even though we're subjugated by the government and the government is somehow benevolent to us, we live in a fascist tyranny. And that's all there is to it. And there's no hope in this government because the Democrat, Republican, they're all involved with it. They're all the same. Okay, just a couple of little announcements. One, my book has actually been picked up by a publisher, amazingly enough. I didn't. In fact, that was after I had rejected. Interestingly, I had rejected any publisher. They so insistent that I figured, okay, if they're willing to publish it and market it, then I'm willing to let them try. So they've got it. It's off to the printers. They have it. I'm sure it's going to be released here at some point soon. The book is done. It's off there. So they're going to publish it and they're going to market it, and we'll see what comes of that. It is the only legitimate study of Supreme Court cases. It is the only legitimate book on the politics of the United States and what's really going on. It is a philosophical treatise as much as a treatise on Supreme Court cases. It elucidates. I mean, we talk about the psychology of man, where it and how, and the creation and fall of civilizations, and how things actually work, and the motivations behind what people do, whether politicians or not politicians. So that book will be released here shortly. The other announcement I have to make: there's an organization called, what's it called? Faith and Liberty, which locally has been putting on seminars, poorly attended for the most part, unfortunately. But, you know, it's not Lady Gaga, the genius that Lady Gaga is, and we're not Madonna. All we're trying to do is educate, and we're not trying to make you ignorant, so we're having problems. But we are going to have another seminar at St. Joseph's Church in Edinburgh this Sunday at 6 p.m. If you can attend, I think it's something that's educational. It's interesting. If you want to, we'd appreciate attendance. It's free. You know, you don't have to give any money. You don't have to buy a ticket. You can show up and you can listen to the revolutionary talk that we have, because that's what it is in our society. Now, if you want to listen to the garbage of Tom Brokaw and Katie Couric and Oprah Winfrey and Barack Obama and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and George Bush and all the rest, and you want to buy their tripe, then go ahead. And if you want to continue listening to our academicians, go ahead. If you want to keep listening to Brad Pitt and his silly wife, then go ahead. But if you want to learn something, you want to know what this country is all about, and what our founding fathers were trying to achieve, and how their achievement was subverted by those that were placed in, that had the responsibility of maintaining it, by the betrayal of the American ideal by those responsible for maintaining that ideal. It's not only the political class, of course, but also the general population. Then maybe then you'll have a glimmer of the way things should have been, ought to have been, and how they have been subverted and undermined by the very institutions that were in charge of maintaining those principles and ideals. Just because we have a government that says it's the United States of America government, just because we have a government that says it adheres to the Constitution or doesn't, just because we have a government that talks about freedom, liberty, and independence, doesn't mean that they are what they say that they are. We live in a fascist tyranny by definition. It is a government that has involved itself in the lives of every single American in one way or another, in one form or another, and that wish to subjugate the American people to the whims of the aristocratic class, which is our government. We have replaced a king with a president, but it is the same. We have replaced a aristocracy with the Congress, and we have replaced the priestly class with judiciary. The names change, but their attitudes are the same. We live in a fascist tyranny of big government. The Democrats and Republicans are both part and parcel of that tyranny. They are both, we have an illegitimate government. Legality and legitimacy are not synonyms. Passing a law does not make it legitimate. Passing an amendment does not make it constitutional. We live in a government, in a country that is no longer a constitutionally based one. We live one that is based upon the principles of fascist tyranny. And that is all there is to it. Can something be done to undo it? Well, our founding fathers undid it, but what did they have to do? And so therefore, the trajectory of the American government, based upon historical precedent, is a nation that's going to become increasingly dictatorial, increasingly tyrannical, and will ultimately collapse. Because the greatness of a nation is from the producers of a nation, which exempts and excludes government and the parasites. The productivity of a nation is due directly to the amount of liberty, freedom, and independence that can be exhibited by the individual citizens. As that level of liberty, independence, and freedom is reduced throughout the nation, then the productivity will decrease, the innovation will decrease, the inventiveness will decrease. Eventually, it will decrease to such a level that we will break up into separate parts because of economic collapse, or we will be weakened enough that we can be invaded by another power that will break up the nation. But the nation will be broken up into regions or maybe smaller entities. Hopefully within those pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, there will be enough, or there will be a place where those of us who believe in individual liberty, freedom, and independence will have a sanctuary. There's no way of knowing for sure. However, what is for sure is that this country is going to collapse. For all practical purposes, is no longer the United States of America. It is a tyranny, a fascist tyranny. We may call ourselves whatever we want to call ourselves, but for all practical purposes, we are not the nation of our origins. We have been reconquered by the counter-revolutionaries. And I like to use that term to refer to our government as the victory of counter-revolutionaries, because that is exactly what they are. Barack Obama is a counter-revolutionary. George Bush is a counter-revolutionary. John Kennedy was a counter-revolutionary. Bill Clinton was a counter-revolutionary. And I like applying those terms because it really gets to that very segment of society that most supports the Clintons and the Obamas, that most supports them and their silly wives in what they do. They are counter-revolutionaries because they have countered the revolution of the founding fathers, and they have undermined the Constitution, undermined the principles of the government, undermined the ideal of we the people, that it is we the people that create the government, and the government exists as the means to protect and guarantee the rights of the people, that the government exists at the sufferance of the people, and that the government exists to serve the people, and not that the people serve the government. That we are not subjects to a king, whether it's King George III or King Barack Obama. But most of the population has become parasitic and lives off the king and becomes and benefits from the king. Everybody who accepts a food stamp lives on the government plantation. Everyone that takes Medicaid and Medicare lives on the government plantation. Everyone that takes a Social Security check lives on the government plantation. And who benefits most from these programs? Well, the rich, of course. People on Medicaid are not rich. People taking food stamps are not rich. But where the food stamps end up and where the Medicaid payment ends up is in the hands of the rich. Nothing changes. The aristocratic class takes from the producers and through mechanisms of government legislation transfers that money from the producers to the non-producers and ultimately to the parasitic aristocratic class. So the Pfizers and the General Electrics and all the rest that benefit from the parasitism of the government, that receive funding through the programs that they themselves promote, that enslaves us all. That is where the money ends up, in the fat cat rich of the northeastern elite and the Californian degenerates. That's where the money ends up, with the Hillarys and the Bills and the Schumers and the Pelosi's and the Kennedys and the Bushes and all the rest. That's where it all ends up, in the hands of the elite, or so-called self-appointed elite. The northeastern elitist that do not believe the people have the right to be free and independent, that do not think that blacks and those so-called Hispanics can make it on their own, that considers poverty a sign of genetic inferiority. And if you don't believe that is what they believe, then read Charles Darwin and read Margaret Sanger, because that is what they believe. And if you read what they wrote, you will see that it is in their writings. And who And what person declares Margaret Sanger elitist, eugenist, racist, anti-Semite? Why, of course, Hillary Clinton, front runner for the next Democratic presidential position. Now, there's a person of interest. Hillary Clinton, who claims to talk to Eleanor Roosevelt, who claims to have been shot at in Bosnia, and claims as a 12-year-old to watch the children of migrant workers in Chicago, for which there are no migrant workers in Chicago, by the way, and people believe that, who has been a failure in everything from wife, lawyer, senator, and secretary of state, who's been an abysmal and complete failure in every endeavor that she has entered, and yet there she is, the front runner. But that's the Democrat Party of Anthony Weiner and Bob Filner. And I mean, there's your Democrat Party. There's your standard bearers of the Democrats. But Robert Filner of California, mayor of California, 5-time congressional member of Congress, and Anthony Weiner of New York. How illustrative that the two most mismanaged or most corrupt and Leninist, Stalinist states in the Union, New York and California, should have representatives that are so much like Mao and Stalin as far as their thought processes. And Anthony Weiner, who until his most recent gaffes was a front runner for the Democrats for mayor of New York City. So that's the party of Bill and Hillary Clinton. But then again, you have the Bushes and what they have done. It was George Bush who actually destroyed the Reagan Revolution. George Bush the greater versus George Bush the lesser, or whatever you want to call them. George Bush the first, George Bush the second. That people are actually thinking about Jeb Bush. I mean, thank goodness that there's no possible way that people are going to forget the carnage that the Bushes have caused the nation. No way. I mean, it's incredible to me. When are they going to get rid of Karl Rove? The Bushes, the Kennedys, the Clintons, the Pelosi's, the useful dupes such as Chuck Schumer and Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and all the other useful dupes that promote the Northeastern Anglo-Saxon elitist program in this country. When are people going to realize the truth? Government only exists for government's sake. And the only reason one has a government is to protect us from other governments. The governments are run by a bunch of gangsters who have taken control of a country for their own benefit and subjugate the people and then create laws justifying their existence. That's all government is. Public education is nothing but the propaganda arm, or one of the propaganda arms of government, which seeks to indoctrinate the individual student that the government is benevolent. It's the only reason a system of public education exists, and that is why it creates this class of indolent, unskilled individuals who are forever dependent upon the handouts from the Hillary Clintons and Bill Clintons and Kennedys. Oh, we have a phone call. Okay, I guess I'll take that. So I pretty much said what I want to say anyway. We have Jesus calling from San Juan, 7 KRV. Thanks for calling.
Yes, sir. Hello?
Yes, you're on. What you got to say?
Gelman, first of all, let me tell you, I love your show. Great show. My question to you is that, what do you think of Senator Ted Cruz? Maybe it's different from what you're talking about, but Senator Cruz, do you think he's a real thing, or do you think he's just a regular politician? Just a regular
I've been
You're a
burned.
politician.
I
That's
tend to
my
be.
question to you.
I understand.
And also, one more thing.
Okay, sure.
Do you think he can make some headway, or do you think he has a chance of probably getting elected, maybe, or not really? I mean, because of the establishment. But what's your opinion on that, sir? Thank you.
Okay. I've been burned before. Marco Rubio has been a great disappointment. He's not a constitutionalist, and I thought, you're talking about Ted Cruz, I thought Marco Rubio was like before Ted, he was the first Ted Cruz. But he's turned out to be a great disappointment. Really doesn't understand the Constitution and is really just a big government hack like all the rest. What I have found is this, that when a political party out of power says one thing, and when they get into power, they do something else. Ted Cruz sounds good, sounds like a constitutionalist, sounds like someone who wants to take the country back to its constitutional origins. However, look at the Republican Party in charge of the House. The Republican Party could defund the budget, according to the Constitution, does not originate with the president. It originates in the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives can make a budget any way that it wants. And the House of Representatives could defund Obamacare or Affordable Care Act without any problem whatsoever and still maintain the rest of the budget. Everything else is play acting. The budget comes from the Congress, and the budget can make a Congress saying, we are going to fund this, this, and that, and submit it to the Senate, and then submit that to the president for signature. I'm not even sure if it has to go to the president for signature. It's the budget. But they won't do it. And this nonsense that it's either all or none, or this nonsense that if you don't, that shut down the government, which would, what's so bad about that, by the way? Talk about a $4 trillion albatross around the productivity of the nation. Okay, my point is the Republicans talk a big game when they're out of power. They get into power. They could do all these things. They do nothing. The Republicans were in power for 6 years with the Republican House, Senate, and Congress. Did nothing. Nothing about the abortion of the undelivered infant. Did nothing about agricultural subsidies. Did nothing about energy policy. Did nothing about education. Did nothing about anything. And they could have, but they didn't. So Ted Cruz sounds good. On a national level, I think you're right, not much hope, because what he says is opposed to by the Republican establishment, which is Karl Rove and the Bush family. That's the Republican establishment, which destroyed the Reagan Revolution. Until you get rid of Karl Rove and until you toss the Bushes on the ash heap of society, I don't see. The Republican Party is actually worse than the Democrat Party. The Democrats are proud communists and fascists, and all their programs do nothing but foment that. The problem with the Republicans is they say one thing and do another, and they dissipate the energy of the libertarian movement because they say that they're conservative libertarians, but then behave as big government. And so what Ted Cruz, what would he do with authority, I don't know. Right now he sounds good. But I don't know what, but the way he sounds, the Republican establishment will not accept him because the Republican establishment is pro-big government. And the Republican establishment puts up candidates like McCain and Romney, who are nothing but big government hacks. And they put them up because even though there are those that they could put up that would win that appeal to the libertarian base, the Republicans would much rather lose and maintain their control over the party. The party establishment would much rather lose and maintain control of the Republican Party, even though the Republicans are not in power. They much prefer that than to lose the control of the party to the libertarian movement by winning. That is what the Republicans learned from Ronald Reagan. Republicans learned that you put in a Ronald Reagan, and he's an American and believes in the Constitution of the United States. Ronald Reagan was an American, not a Republican, not a Democrat. And the Republicans can't stand that. And therefore, they put up George Bush to destroy the Republican Revolution, the Reagan Revolution, which is exactly what he did. So the Republicans are not ever going to allow another Reagan to come along, because that would reduce the establishment Republicans' power within the party, which to them is more important than to gain control of the political scene in Washington, D.C. Okay, we're done for today. 7 to KRV, Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the microphone. You're not going to hear this anywhere else, because Rush Limbaugh and Hannity are frauds. And we'll see you maybe next week. Bye.